Shalom and welcome. Today we begin the book of Numbers, in Hebrew Bamidbar, with the Torah portion by the same name, Bamidbar. And after pausing in the narrative of the Israelites and their movement from Egypt to their promised land in Canaan for the book of Leviticus, we now pick up the narrative again. But before we begin with the narrative comes this Torah portion, and actually not only this Torah portion, but the first part of the next Torah portion, Naso, for next week, with counting people, a census. But not just one census. In this Torah portion, there are actually 3 acts of counting different groups of people. And this counting continues with different groups of people at the end of this portion and actually the beginning of the next portion. The counting is of all the people, some of the people, different age groups of people, and then continues with describing the functions of the various families of Levites, and then the counting of those families and a restatement of their functions. And when it talks about the Kohites, it talks about their function being to carry and care for the most holy of things, like the ark. And it speaks of their not going in where these things are, in the Holy of Holies, where the holiest things are, until the priests have covered everything up, and there's then no danger of them dying because they've come in front of these holy of holy things that only the priests are supposed to go near, essentially behind closed doors. And so that part of the procedure, the Torah portion tells us this is what you shall do to them so that they shall not die. Well, the story I have today takes that sentence as the link. But I'm going to explain this link because as I was reading it, I'm saying, what the heck is this link? And then I realized what the link is. The story is about someone who renounces religion and then comes back to it. And there's feelings among some groups of Jews that if you renounce religion and walk away, it's as if you had died. So because the subject of the story comes back, it's as if this death had been averted by performing a particular procedure. There's a Hebrew word that's used in the story, very common for us on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The word is teshuvah. Teshuvah is normally, in our prayer books, translated as repentance. Not really what the Hebrew means, because it comes from the root shuv, which is to turn. And what it really carries the sense of is to return specifically to God. So when this word is used in the story, that's the context we're using it in, returning to God. And it sometimes actually uses a verb. So you'll see in the story. It isn't a very long story. So it happened that a man who lived in the same town as the Baal Shem Tov came to the Baal Shem Tov, said, Rebbe, I have no children. I desperately want to have a son. Can you give me a blessing so that I would have a son? This was not an uncommon thing for the Baal Shem Tov to receive a request for this kind of blessing. He looked at the man and he said, I can give you a blessing, but you must know that the son that will be born to you will become a rebellious son. The man thought for a moment. Rabbi, I still want the blessing. So the Baal Shem Tov gave him a blessing. And sure enough, not quite a year later, he has a son born to him. He names his son Yussel. And Yussel is a very good boy. He goes to the cheder, he learns, he's no trouble at all. Finally comes at his bar mitzvah, and that's when the problems begin. He has problems with various things. He actually becomes rebellious, argues with his parents, finally gets to the point where he becomes an apostate. He actually renounces religion. I'm no longer Jewish or anything else. Well, he stays with his parents for a short time, having more and more arguments. Finally, he leaves. He leaves home, and he goes and gets a job with a cobbler, kind of like an apprenticeship. And this cobbler also is an apostate. And he moves in with the cobbler. Father is very upset. Goes back to the Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi, I'm so upset the way my son has been acting. But I told you he would become a rebellious son, and still you wanted the son. I know, Rebbe, I know, but seeing the way he acts just tears me up. Every time I think about it, I get sick. The Baal Shem Tov looks at him, and his compassion overwhelms him. I will give you an amulet, and if you can get your son to touch the amulet, then he will return and stop being rebellious. So the Baal Shem Tov gets a piece of paper and his pen, and he writes out this amulet, and he gives it to the father. So the father waits for a while until he's sure the son has left the cobbler's residence. And he goes in, he finds a pile of his son's things, and he kind of hides the amulet inside this pile, sure that if his son just simply reaches in to look for something, he's bound to touch the amulet. And sure enough, his son comes back, needs something, reaches his hand in, and in fact, yes, touches the amulet. And he's overcome with the realization of what has happened. Oh my, what have I done? And the sense of all of his sins overwhelms him. Comes back to the village, the Baal Shem Tov. And he goes into the Baal Shem Tov and he says, I really feel terrible about what I've done. Can you help me to come back to the ways of being Jewish and following Judaism and a Jewish way of life? The Baal Shem Tov looks at him and tells him, yes, I will teach you the way of teshuvah. If you have a heartfelt teshuvah, remember this means a returning, then everything will be fine. So the Baal Shem Tov teaches him the way of teshuvah, and he returns to the Jewish way of life. And from then on, he travels about the Ukrainian countryside, and he tells everybody how he was at the 49th gate of sins, just like the Israelites were when they were in Egypt before being redeemed and let out of Egypt. And how he has come and become a tzaddik, a righteous person. And he helps others to realize that if he can come back from where he was, surely they can do teshuvah. And if they start from a higher place than what he was, what heights could they get to? This is the story of Yosel. And it's the story of someone who comes back. So he almost died in one sense, but then was protected and came back. Shalom.